It was a peaceful morning when Marcus Carter, a successful black entrepreneur in his early 40s, drove through the upscale neighborhood he had recently moved into. The sky was clear, the sun casting a warm glow over the tree-lined streets, and Marcus was on his way to finalize a major business acquisition that would cement his position as one of the most prominent property owners in the area. Life had been good lately. His hard work was finally paying off, and he felt a sense of pride as he cruised through his new surroundings. As he made his way down the road, Marcus noticed flashing lights in his rearview mirror. A police car was behind him, signaling for him to pull over. At first, he thought nothing of it. Perhaps it was a routine check, or maybe he had unknowingly violated a minor traffic rule. Either way, Marcus wasn't worried. He had always lived a clean life, and there was no reason for him to feel threatened by this encounter. After all, he had done nothing wrong. Pulling over to the side of the road, Marcus turned off his engine and waited calmly for the officer to approach. As he watched the officer walk toward his car, he couldn't help but notice the tension in the man's posture. The officer, a white man in his mid-40s, wore a stern expression as he tapped on Marcus's window. Rolling it down, Marcus greeted him with a polite smile, ready to cooperate. But the atmosphere quickly shifted, and Marcus could sense that this was not going to be the routine stop he had anticipated. Marcus was no stranger to hard work. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, he had always dreamed of making something of himself, and over the years, he had done just that. From humble beginnings, Marcus had built a successful real estate business, acquiring properties across the city and earning the respect of his peers. Now, as he sat in his luxury car in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods, he couldn't help but feel proud of how far he had come. Dressed sharply in a tailored suit, Marcus exuded confidence and success. His car, a symbol of his achievements, was sleek and polished, its interior immaculate. To anyone who passed by, he looked like a man in control, someone who had earned his place in the world. But as the officer's eyes scanned him and his vehicle, Marcus felt the weight of the officer's assumptions pressing down on him. Despite his calm demeanor, Marcus knew the reality of situations like this. As a black man, he had experienced discrimination before, and he had learned how to navigate it with grace. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but there was something in the officer's eyes that made him uneasy. A look that suggested Marcus wasn't being seen for who he truly was, but rather through the lens of prejudice and suspicion. Officer Bradley, a veteran of the force, approached the car with a hardened expression. To him, this was just another stop in a neighborhood where expensive cars and luxury homes weren't usually associated with people who looked like Marcus. The officer had been on the force for over 20 years, and in that time, he had developed his own set of assumptions about the people he encountered. Unfortunately, those assumptions were often based on stereotypes rather than facts. As he reached Marcus's window, Officer Bradley's eyes immediately scanned the interior of the car, taking in the luxury and sophistication that seemed at odds with the man behind the wheel. Without introducing himself or explaining why he had stopped Marcus, the officer's tone was sharp. "License and registration," he barked, his hand resting on his holster, as if preparing for confrontation. There was no hint of courtesy or respect in his voice. Marcus, keeping his composure, reached for his documents without hesitation. He had been through this before, and he knew that reacting with anger or frustration would only escalate the situation. Still, the way the officer was looking at him, like he didn't belong in this neighborhood, in this car, was all too familiar. Despite the success Marcus had achieved, moments like these reminded him that, to some people, he would always be judged by the color of his skin before anything else. Officer Bradley wasn't satisfied with just the routine check of Marcus's license and registration. After briefly glancing at the documents, he looked back at Marcus with a skeptical expression. "This your car?" he asked, his tone accusatory rather than inquisitive. The question itself carried an underlying message, one that suggested Marcus didn't fit the image of someone who should be driving such a vehicle in this part of town. Marcus took a deep breath, remaining calm despite the rising frustration. He had worked hard for everything he had, and being questioned like this, as if his success was somehow suspicious, was something he had encountered far too often. "Yes, officer, it's my car," Marcus replied firmly, keeping his tone respectful. But the officer wasn't convinced. Bradley's eyes scanned the dashboard, as if searching for something out of place, something to justify his suspicions. The exchange between them felt tense, as if Bradley was determined to find fault where there was none. "Where are you headed?" the officer asked, continuing his line of questioning with an edge in his voice. Marcus, still composed, answered truthfully, explaining that he was on his way to finalize a business acquisition in the area. But even as he spoke, Marcus could tell that the officer wasn't interested in the details. He had already made up his mind about who Marcus was. As the questioning continued, Officer Bradley's suspicion only seemed to grow. He wasn't satisfied with Marcus's calm answers or the clean paperwork. In his mind, something still didn't add up. Without warning, Bradley demanded that Marcus step out of the vehicle. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his hand resting even more firmly on his holster, a subtle but clear threat of force if Marcus didn't comply. Marcus, though deeply frustrated, knew better than to resist. He had seen how quickly these situations could escalate, and the last thing he wanted was for things to spiral out of control. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out of his car, standing tall but inwardly seething at the treatment he was receiving. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal simply because of the assumptions the officer had made. Officer Bradley wasted no time in starting a search of the vehicle. He rifled through the car's interior, checking compartments, lifting the seats, and treating every inch of the vehicle as if it were hiding something illegal. Marcus stood by helplessly, his dignity stripped away in front of passers-by who glanced curiously at the scene. To them, it might have looked like a routine stop, but to Marcus, it felt like a public humiliation based on nothing but prejudice. The street had started to attract attention. Neighbors in the area were beginning to watch the interaction from a distance, their curiosity piqued by the sight of a black man being subjected to a humiliating search in such a wealthy neighborhood. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, the weight of their judgment bearing down. He wasn't just being humiliated by the officer, he was being made a spectacle, a public display of power and control. Despite the growing crowd of onlookers, Officer Bradley showed no sign of stopping. He continued his invasive search, treating Marcus's car as if it were a crime scene. The air was thick with tension, and Marcus's patience was being tested to its limits. He stood still, hands at his sides, his face a mask of calm, but inside his anger was building. He knew that this was about more than just a traffic stop. This was about reminding him of his place, about asserting power over him. What the officer didn't realize was that Marcus was no ordinary man. He wasn't just passing through the neighborhood, he was the new owner of one of the largest properties in the area. And while Officer Bradley was bent on asserting his authority, Marcus knew that his own power extended far beyond this moment. He would not allow this humiliation to define him, nor would he allow it to go unanswered. As Officer Bradley's search came up empty, his frustration became more apparent. He had expected to find something, anything, that would justify the aggressive treatment he was giving Marcus. But with each passing moment, it became clearer that Marcus was exactly who he said he was, a legitimate businessman with no reason to be treated with suspicion. Yet the officer wasn't ready to admit defeat. Instead, he turned to accusation. "You've got something you're hiding, don't you?" Bradley said, his voice laced with anger. Marcus, standing calmly by the side of the road, shook his head. "No, officer. I've told you the truth from the beginning," he responded evenly, though the injustice of the situation was beginning to weigh heavily on him. He had done nothing wrong, and yet here he was, being treated as if his very existence was criminal. The accusations stung, not because they were true, but because they were so blatantly rooted in prejudice. Marcus had worked hard to build his reputation, his business, and his life. He had earned everything he owned, and yet, in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. To Officer Bradley, Marcus was just another black man in a nice car, someone who didn't belong in this neighborhood. And that assumption was all the officer needed to justify his actions. Throughout the entire ordeal, Marcus maintained his composure. Years of facing subtle and overt discrimination had taught him how to handle situations like this, how to keep his emotions in check, how to stay calm when everything inside him was screaming for justice. He knew that reacting with anger would only give Officer Bradley more reason to escalate the situation, and so he stood silently, watching as the officer's frustration grew with each passing minute. There was a quiet confidence in the way Marcus held himself, a confidence that Bradley couldn't understand. The officer had expected Marcus to be rattled, to break under the pressure of the search and the accusations. But instead, Marcus remained steady, his calm demeanor only serving to heighten the tension. Bradley didn't know that Marcus had something far more powerful than fear on his side. He had the truth. As the search dragged on with no results, Marcus could sense that a shift was coming. Bradley's authority, which had seemed so absolute at the beginning of the encounter, was starting to falter. The officer was beginning to realize that he had made a mistake, but he wasn't ready to admit it yet. For Marcus, this was the calm before the storm, the moment before the full weight of the situation came crashing down on the officer. Even though Officer Bradley was growing more aggressive in his questioning, Marcus remained unshaken. There was something in his demeanor that hinted at a deeper truth, something Bradley hadn't yet figured out. The officer couldn't understand why this man wasn't afraid, why he wasn't reacting the way most people did in situations like this. The calmness in Marcus's eyes unsettled him, but he wasn't ready to back down. What Officer Bradley didn't know was that Marcus held a secret that would turn the entire situation on its head. The confidence Marcus carried wasn't just from years of enduring injustice, it was from the knowledge that he was far more powerful than the officer could ever imagine. While Bradley saw him as just another man to control, Marcus knew that the tables would soon turn. He was no stranger to power, but unlike Bradley, Marcus didn't need to flaunt it. Standing tall, Marcus met Bradley's gaze with quiet defiance, his silence saying more than words ever could. The officer, still unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface, continued his questioning, but there was a subtle shift in the air. Marcus's confidence wasn't just mysterious, it was unsettling. And soon enough, the officer would realize why. Officer Bradley, unwilling to admit that his search had turned up nothing, doubled down on his aggressive tactics. His questions became more pointed, his voice sharper. "You think you can just stroll through this neighborhood without raising suspicion?" he snapped, his frustration boiling over. To him, Marcus's calm demeanor felt like defiance, and the more Marcus stayed composed, the more determined Bradley became to assert his authority. Marcus stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated. He had nothing to hide, and he knew that the officer's behavior was becoming increasingly irrational. Still, he answered each question with measured calm, refusing to give Bradley the reaction he was looking for. "I've done nothing wrong, officer," Marcus repeated, his voice steady. But Bradley wasn't interested in the truth. He was interested in maintaining control. The more the officer pushed, the more it became clear that he was grasping at straws. But instead of backing off, Bradley's pride kept him locked into a power struggle he couldn't win. He didn't know that the man standing in front of him was the new owner of one of the most prestigious properties in the area, a man with far more influence than Bradley could ever imagine. But Marcus wasn't about to reveal that just yet. He wanted the officer to dig his own grave first. As the tense situation continued, more people began to take notice. Neighbors walking their dogs, jogging through the neighborhood, or simply enjoying the morning were now slowing down, their curiosity piqued by the ongoing confrontation. Some of them stood at a distance, quietly observing, while others subtly glanced from behind their windows. The sight of a black man being subjected to an aggressive search by a police officer in this upscale neighborhood drew more attention than usual. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, and although he maintained his composure, the weight of the public scrutiny added another layer of humiliation. He knew what it looked like. A well-dressed black man being searched by an officer in broad daylight, as if he didn't belong in this wealthy neighborhood. It was a narrative he had encountered many times before. But Marcus wasn't just another passerby. He had a right to be here, and more than that, this neighborhood was part of his latest acquisition. Officer Bradley, on the other hand, seemed undeterred by the growing audience. In fact, their presence seemed to embolden him, as if he felt the need to put on a show of authority. Each time a passerby glanced over, the officer became even more aggressive, determined to assert his dominance in front of the watchful eyes of the community. But what Bradley didn't know was that his performance would soon unravel, and the audience would witness a very different power dynamic unfold. Despite the relentless questioning and invasive search, Marcus remained unfazed. He had seen this kind of behavior before, an officer trying to push him to his breaking point, hoping for a reaction that would justify the aggressive treatment. But Marcus wasn't going to give Bradley that satisfaction. He stood tall, his expression calm, refusing to let the officer's intimidation tactics get to him. Marcus knew who he was, and no amount of humiliation could take that away. Every time Bradley raised his voice or insinuated wrongdoing, Marcus responded with quiet dignity. His composure wasn't just a survival tactic, it was a statement. Marcus understood the power of restraint, and in this moment, it was his greatest weapon. No matter how hard Bradley tried to provoke him, Marcus's calmness served as a reminder that he wasn't just a victim of this abuse. He was a man in control of his emotions and his destiny. While the officer saw Marcus's silence as a form of defiance, Marcus knew that staying calm was his way of maintaining the upper hand. He had no reason to fear Bradley, and soon enough the officer would realize that the situation was far bigger than he had anticipated. Marcus's confidence, his refusal to be broken by the abuse, was what would ultimately turn the tide. After what felt like an eternity, Officer Bradley finally stepped back from the car, having found nothing to support his suspicions. His frustration was palpable, and though he had no valid reason to detain Marcus any longer, his pride wouldn't allow him to admit defeat so easily. Bradley shot Marcus one last suspicious glance, as if hoping to find something, anything, that would justify the humiliating ordeal he had put him through. Marcus, however, remained silent, watching the officer with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the entire encounter. He knew this wasn't over, but it wasn't his place to escalate things. In Marcus's mind, the wheels of justice were already turning, and the officer's reckoning was coming, sooner than he could have imagined. As Bradley prepared to leave, Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady and unwavering. "You're going to regret this," he said quietly, his words laced with a calm certainty. The officer didn't respond. He couldn't, because deep down, he knew Marcus was right. Without another word, Bradley walked back to his patrol car, the tension still thick in the air. The onlookers, who had remained silently observing, slowly began to disperse, unsure of what they had just witnessed. But Marcus knew that this was far from over. The power Bradley had tried so hard to assert would soon crumble under the weight of the truth. Once Officer Bradley had left the scene, Marcus stood there for a moment, allowing himself to fully absorb what had just happened. He had been humiliated, treated like a criminal in a neighborhood where he not only belonged but was a prominent figure. But Marcus wasn't one to let an injustice like this go unchecked. He knew that retaliation didn't need to be loud or immediate. His power was in his silence, in the knowledge that the real reckoning was on its way. After taking a deep breath, Marcus calmly returned to his car and drove off. He wasn't heading to his business meeting just yet. Instead, he made a phone call to his lawyer. Marcus knew exactly how to handle situations like this, and his lawyer was well-versed in dealing with cases of discrimination and abuse of power. Marcus didn't need to raise his voice or seek revenge. He simply needed to let the system work in his favor. What Officer Bradley didn't know was that Marcus was about to leverage his influence in ways that would soon make the officer regret ever crossing him. The humiliation Marcus had endured would be short-lived, but the consequences for Bradley's actions would be long-lasting. The officer had made a critical mistake. He had underestimated the man he had chosen to humiliate, and now Marcus was quietly preparing to turn the tables. As soon as Marcus ended the call with his lawyer, he placed another one, to the real estate firm he had recently acquired. The firm was a prestigious establishment, handling some of the most valuable properties in the city. And now, Marcus was not only its largest client, he was also its new owner. This was something that Officer Bradley had no idea about during their encounter. The neighborhood where Marcus had been stopped was part of a development project he had just closed the deal on. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Marcus. Here he was, a man who owned significant portions of the city, being treated like he didn't belong. But instead of dwelling on the injustice, Marcus was already thinking several steps ahead. His connections ran deep, and he had the resources to make sure that the officer's actions wouldn't go unnoticed. It wasn't just about personal revenge. It was about holding those in power accountable for their misuse of authority. Marcus knew that with one phone call, he could escalate this situation to the highest levels, and that's exactly what he intended to do. Officer Bradley had treated him like a nobody, but Marcus was about to show him the true extent of his influence. The power dynamic was about to shift dramatically, and Marcus was ready to take control of the narrative. The following week, Officer Bradley was called into his supervisor's office. The atmosphere was tense, and as he entered the room, he immediately sensed that something was off. His supervisor, a stern-faced man in his 50s, sat behind the desk with a folder in front of him, flipping through pages with a grim expression. "Bradley, we need to talk," he said, gesturing for the officer to sit down. Bradley, confused but maintaining his usual demeanor, took a seat. As the supervisor spoke, he revealed information that sent a chill down Bradley's spine. "Do you remember the traffic stop you made last week? The one in the new development area?" Bradley nodded, unsure of where this was going. "The man you pulled over. Do you know who he is?" The supervisor continued. Bradley's mind raced as he tried to recall details about Marcus, but nothing about the man had seemed out of the ordinary at the time. "No, sir, just another routine stop." The supervisor slid the folder across the desk. "That man, Marcus Carter, isn't just anyone. He's the new owner of the largest development project in this city. And more than that, he's someone with powerful connections. We've received a formal complaint about your conduct during that stop." Bradley's heart sank. The man he had humiliated and treated with suspicion was far more important than he had realized, and now he was facing the consequences of his actions. The truth hit Officer Bradley like a punch to the gut. Marcus Carter wasn't just another driver passing through a wealthy neighborhood. He was the new owner of one of the most significant properties in the area. The realization that he had humiliated a man of such status, someone who not only belonged in the neighborhood but owned it, made Bradley's stomach churn. The power dynamic had shifted, and now Bradley was the one on the defensive. As his supervisor continued to outline the complaint filed against him, Bradley's mind raced. He had treated Marcus with disrespect, assuming he was an outsider, someone who didn't belong in the world of wealth and influence. But Marcus had been playing a very different game, a game Bradley hadn't even realized he was a part of. The man he had tried to intimidate had more power than Bradley could have imagined, and now that power was being used against him. The humiliation that Marcus had endured was now coming back to Bradley tenfold. He had underestimated the man, and now he was paying the price. The new owner wasn't just going to let this slide. He had the resources and connections to ensure that Bradley's actions would have serious repercussions. The officer's world was about to come crashing down, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the reality of the situation set in, Officer Bradley sat in stunned silence. His mind replayed the traffic stop, the way he had treated Marcus, the baseless accusations, and the humiliating search. He had been so sure of himself, so certain that he was in control of the situation. But now, everything had flipped. The man he had disrespected was someone who wielded far more power than Bradley could have ever imagined. The supervisor's voice broke through Bradley's thoughts. "You didn't just stop anyone, Bradley. You stopped the man who now owns half of this neighborhood. He's someone who can make things very difficult for you, and he's already started." Bradley's heart raced as the weight of the situation became clear. This wasn't just about a complaint. This was about his career, his reputation, and the way his abuse of power was now coming back to haunt him. For the first time, Bradley felt a sense of fear, a fear that he had never experienced in all his years on the force. The man he had tried to humiliate was now in control, and Bradley was powerless to change the course of events. He had overplayed his hand, and now he was on the brink of losing everything he had worked for. The tables had turned, and there was no going back. The power dynamics had shifted dramatically, and Officer Bradley was left to face the consequences of his actions. He had walked into the stop with all the authority of the badge, assuming that Marcus was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now, it was Bradley who was at the mercy of someone far more powerful than he had realized. The balance of power was no longer tilted in his favor. Marcus was holding all the cards. As Bradley sat in his supervisor's office, the reality of his situation began to sink in. The arrogance he had once felt was replaced by a growing sense of dread. He had crossed the wrong man. The power he had so casually flaunted during the stop had evaporated, leaving him vulnerable to the fallout of his own actions. Bradley had underestimated Marcus, and now he was the one under scrutiny. For Marcus, the shift in power was subtle but profound. He didn't need to shout or demand revenge. His influence and connections did the work for him. While Bradley had relied on intimidation and authority, Marcus's power came from something deeper: his reputation, his wealth, and his ability to navigate a world that Bradley had no access to. The officer had made a fatal miscalculation, and now he was at the mercy of the man he had tried to humiliate. The next day, Marcus walked into the police station with the same quiet confidence that had unsettled Officer Bradley during their initial encounter. He wasn't there to cause a scene. He didn't need to. The complaint had already been filed, and his lawyer was handling the legal aspects. But Marcus wanted to make one thing clear. He wasn't just some nameless man the officer could mistreat without consequences. As Marcus entered the station, heads turned. Word had spread quickly about the complaint and who Marcus really was. Officers and staff, many of whom had witnessed Bradley's behavior in the past, exchanged glances as Marcus made his way to the front desk. He was there to meet with the station's leadership, and his presence was a reminder that the rules applied to everyone, even the ones who wore the badge. When Marcus finally sat down with the chief of police and Bradley's supervisor, he didn't raise his voice or make threats. Instead, he calmly recounted the events of the traffic stop, detailing the unnecessary search and the officer's blatant disrespect. "I understand that you have a difficult job," Marcus said, his tone measured. "But no one, no matter their position, should abuse their power in this way." The message was clear. Marcus was holding them accountable, and there would be no sweeping this under the rug. As the internal investigation into Officer Bradley's conduct began, it became clear that this was no ordinary complaint. Marcus's influence and connections ensured that the investigation would be thorough, and that Bradley's actions would not be overlooked. The officer had crossed a line, and now he was being held accountable in ways he had never anticipated. His once secure position on the force was now in jeopardy. For Bradley, each day brought new anxieties. He had never faced this level of scrutiny before, and the weight of his own actions was becoming unbearable. Colleagues who once treated him with respect now looked at him with a mixture of pity and disdain. The investigation was a constant reminder of how far he had fallen, from the confident officer in control of a situation to a man whose future hung in the balance. Meanwhile, Marcus watched from a distance as the process unfolded. He didn't need to intervene. The system was working as it should. For too long, people like Bradley had gotten away with abusing their authority, and now, for the first time, the officer was facing the real consequences of his actions. Marcus had taken the high road, but the weight of justice was coming down on Bradley, and there was nothing the officer could do to stop it. As the investigation progressed and the reality of his situation set in, Officer Bradley knew he had no choice but to face Marcus again. This time, not as an officer asserting authority, but as a man who had been wrong. Bradley had been advised by his lawyer to issue a formal apology, hoping that it might mitigate the damage done to his reputation and career. But the apology felt hollow, and both men knew that it was too little, too late. Bradley stood outside Marcus's office, nervously waiting to be let in. He wasn't used to feeling this vulnerable, but he knew that he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. When Marcus finally greeted him, there was no anger in his eyes, just a calm, steady gaze that made Bradley feel even smaller. The power dynamic had completely shifted, and Bradley was now the one seeking forgiveness from the man he had disrespected. "I owe you an apology," Bradley began, his voice stiff and uncomfortable. "I was wrong to treat you the way I did." Marcus listened silently, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt or show any emotion, allowing the officer to finish. When Bradley finally stopped speaking, Marcus responded simply. "Your apology is noted, officer," he said, but it doesn't change what happened. Actions have consequences. The words were a reminder that while forgiveness might be given, accountability could not be avoided. The days following Bradley's apology were some of the hardest he had ever faced. The humiliation of being brought low, of realizing how completely he had misjudged the situation, weighed heavily on him. His colleagues, once friendly, now treated him with a distant caution. Bradley was no longer the respected veteran officer. He had become a symbol of what happens when authority is misused, when prejudice blinds judgment. The media caught wind of the complaint, and soon Bradley's name was being discussed in local news reports. The headlines were damning. Officer under investigation for racial profiling, and businessman files complaint after unjust traffic stop. The officer, who had once felt invincible behind his badge, was now the subject of public scrutiny. His reputation, once solid, was unraveling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Marcus, meanwhile, had moved on. He wasn't interested in Bradley's personal downfall. He had no desire for revenge, but he knew that the public humiliation Bradley was experiencing was necessary. The officer needed to understand the pain and degradation he had inflicted on others, and the only way to learn that lesson was to face it himself. The power Bradley had wielded so recklessly was now gone, and in its place was a deep sense of shame that would follow him for the rest of his life. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone who had witnessed the original encounter. Officer Bradley had started the traffic stop with every intention of asserting his authority over Marcus, confident that his badge gave him the right to control the narrative. But now, the roles were completely reversed. Marcus was the one in control, and Bradley was at the mercy of the very system he had once used to his advantage. For Marcus, the role reversal was more symbolic than anything else. He had never sought to humiliate Bradley the way the officer had humiliated him. Instead, he allowed the situation to unfold naturally, knowing that Bradley's own actions would be his undoing. The system, which had so often failed people like Marcus, was now working in his favor, and he didn't need to lift a finger to make it happen. Bradley, on the other hand, was forced to confront the reality of his situation. He had always believed that his badge gave him the ultimate power in any encounter, but now he realized how fragile that power really was. In the end, it wasn't his authority that mattered. It was the integrity with which he wielded it. And in this case, Bradley had failed spectacularly. As the investigation into Officer Bradley's conduct drew to a close, the lesson became clear. Authority, when misused, comes with consequences. Bradley had believed that his position as a police officer gave him the right to treat Marcus with suspicion and disrespect. But he had been wrong. Authority isn't a free pass to mistreat people. It's a responsibility to protect and serve with fairness and respect. Marcus's calm response to the situation had been a stark contrast to Bradley's aggressive tactics. Where Bradley had relied on intimidation, Marcus had relied on patience and strategy. In the end, it was Marcus's quiet resilience that had won the day. The officer had been so blinded by his own prejudice that he had failed to see Marcus for who he really was. A man of power and influence, someone who could change the course of events with a single phone call. For Bradley, the lesson was a painful one. He had spent years on the force, believing that his badge gave him the right to act without question. But now he realized that true authority comes from respect, not fear. The consequences of his actions had been swift and severe, and they served as a reminder that no one is above the law, not even those who are tasked with enforcing it. Through it all, Marcus had remained patient. He hadn't reacted with anger or aggression during the traffic stop, even when Bradley had pushed him to his limits. Instead, Marcus had relied on the power of patience, knowing that the truth would come to light in its own time. His calm demeanor during the encounter had been his greatest weapon, and it had allowed him to maintain control even in the face of humiliation. Patience, Marcus understood, wasn't just about waiting. It was about knowing when to act. He had acted with precision, filing the complaint at the right time, contacting his lawyer, and using his connections to ensure that the investigation would be thorough. But he never let his emotions get the best of him, even when Bradley had tried to provoke him. Marcus had played the long game, and in the end, it had paid off. For Bradley, the power of patience was a foreign concept. He had tried to rush through the situation, to assert his authority in the moment, without considering the long-term consequences. But Marcus had shown him that patience, when coupled with strategy, was far more powerful than any badge or uniform. The officer had lost control because he had been too focused on immediate dominance, while Marcus had been focused on the bigger picture. At its core, Marcus's story was one of resilience. He had faced injustice head-on, and instead of allowing it to break him, he had used it as an opportunity to hold those in power accountable. Marcus's strength didn't come from retaliation. It came from his ability to navigate a system that had been designed to work against him. He understood the game being played, and he played it better than Officer Bradley ever could have anticipated. The traffic stop could have been a devastating experience for Marcus. He had been publicly humiliated, treated with disrespect, and subjected to baseless accusations. But Marcus refused to let that moment define him. Instead, he used it as a catalyst for change, turning the tables on the very system that had tried to diminish him. His resilience wasn't just about surviving the encounter, it was about thriving in the aftermath. Through his quiet determination, Marcus had shown that true power comes not from brute force, but from the ability to rise above adversity. His story was a reminder that even in the face of injustice, resilience can lead to justice. Marcus had taken a moment of personal humiliation and transformed it into a victory, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly by those in power. In the end, Marcus didn't need to boast about his victory. His actions spoke for themselves. The complaint he had filed against Officer Bradley had resulted in a thorough investigation, and the consequences for the officer were swift. Bradley had been suspended from the force pending further review, and his reputation was in tatters. But for Marcus, the real triumph wasn't in Bradley's downfall. It was in the knowledge that justice had been served. Marcus had walked away from the traffic stop with his dignity intact, refusing to let the officer's abuse of power shake him. And now, as the dust settled, Marcus could reflect on the experience with a sense of pride. He had stood his ground, remained calm, and allowed the system to work in his favor. It wasn't about revenge, it was about setting things right. And in the end, Marcus had done just that. For Marcus, the victory was quiet but profound. He had shown that even in the face of systemic injustice, it was possible to fight back with patience, resilience, and dignity. His quiet triumph was a testament to the power of perseverance, and it served as a reminder that those who misuse their authority would ultimately be held accountable. Marcus's story was a victory for justice, and it was one that would not be forgotten. For Officer Bradley, the fallout from the incident left him with no choice but to reflect on his actions. The investigation had taken its toll, both professionally and personally. He had been forced to confront the reality of his behavior, the way he had treated Marcus, the assumptions he had made, and the abuse of power that had led to his downfall. The badge that had once given him authority now felt like a burden, a symbol of his failure to live up to its responsibilities. As Bradley sat alone in his home, suspended from the force, he couldn't shake the image of Marcus's calm, steady gaze during the traffic stop. The man had never raised his voice, never shown anger or fear, even as Bradley had treated him with suspicion and disrespect. Bradley had misjudged Marcus completely, and now he was paying the price. The role reversal was complete, and Bradley was left to reckon with the consequences of his actions. The officer's reflection wasn't just about one incident. It was about a career built on the misuse of authority, on the belief that his badge gave him the right to treat people differently based on their appearance. Now, stripped of that power, Bradley had to confront the uncomfortable truth. He had been wrong. And the lesson he had learned, though painful, was one he would carry with him for the rest of his life. In the end, justice had come full circle. Marcus, the man who had been humiliated and disrespected, had emerged victorious. He hadn't needed to shout or demand retribution. His quiet dignity and strategic actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. The system, which so often failed people like Marcus, had worked in his favor this time. And while it hadn't been an easy journey, the outcome was a reminder that justice could prevail, even in the face of prejudice. For Marcus, the victory wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. He had fought back against an abuse of power and won, not through force, but through resilience and patience. His story was a testament to the power of perseverance and the importance of holding those in authority accountable for their actions. It was a reminder that, in the end, justice has a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how long it takes. As Marcus moved forward with his life and business, he carried with him the knowledge that he had stood up for himself in the face of injustice. The traffic stop, once a moment of humiliation, had become a turning point, one that had reshaped not only his life, but the lives of those who had witnessed it. Justice had come full circle, and Marcus was living proof that dignity, patience, and strength could prevail, even in the most trying of circumstances.